Hey everybody, we're back. I'm Susan Lindner, your host of the Innovation Storytellers Show. And today is going to be a triple decker. We are going to be talking about layers and layers upon layers of innovation as we go through the career of the incredible Shubber Ali, who I'm so excited to have on. I got to meet at a meeting of fantastic innovators and folks with really just breakthrough ideas called Samudra, the Samudra Leadership Trust. And if you haven't heard of it, well, follow the show notes and you'll get to learn a little bit more about it. But it was breakthrough for me because I just got to hear from so many different leaders from so many different corners of the innovation world. Everything from Disney animators to storytellers to Salesforce executives to those working in the wild world of wildlife and plant life these days. So without further ado, let me introduce you to my guest. Shubber Ali has decades of experience in innovation, from building multiple startups, some successful and some not in his words, to Fortune 500 companies like, I don't know, being the VP of Strategic Innovation for Salesforce, to consulting like being the Global Innovation Ninja for Accenture, and to academia and holding positions like Adjunct Professor of Innovation Management at Georgetown in their executive MBA program. So Shubber has seen what works, but more importantly, what doesn't work and why it is so difficult for organizations to actually successfully innovate. Thank you so much for joining me today, Shubber.
You're quite welcome. Thank you for having me, Susan. And I have to say, I am always amazed that people will actually read what I write and just take it as written. That's what I actually did. But no, it's kind of weird hearing introductions for yourself. But thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, honored. And I was fascinated. I just want to start for what was the catalyst for me of having you on the show, which was talking about Salesforce Ignite. And so many of my listeners are really engaged in trying to ignite, to start some kind of innovation program and to create a culture of innovation in their respective organizations. And it's not an easy thing to do. Salesforce, especially when you're coming from like a legacy corporation that's been around for a long time, has lost sight of its values, or if innovation maybe wasn't even a value to begin with. But Salesforce, having this kind of entrepreneurial zeal with Mark Benioff at the helm, it's something that Salesforce has never lost. Can you tell us a little bit more about Ignite and why it was so incredibly special? And my last question about that is, can it be replicated in other places? Or do you think this is so unique to Salesforce and its culture?
No, not at all. I think it can be replicated anywhere. The issue is, why is it so hard for it to be replicated in other places? Which is actually, I think, the part of the problem that needs to be solved. I know we talked a little bit earlier about focusing on the right problem to solve. And to me, that's always the biggest thing. When Ignite was created, it was created.
Well, like, tell us what Ignite is to get started.
Yeah, I will. I
don't know.
There, which is, so the problem that Salesforce was trying to solve was, up until about 2010, 2011, Salesforce primarily sold to small and medium-sized enterprises, right? So, Bob's Plumbing, Acme Printing, that sort of thing, up to a certain size. But it wasn't really into the Fortune 500. Although actually it turned out it was, but it was little tiny pockets in various departments, people buying like 50 licenses for their, their salespeople or for their, whatever. But it wasn't like a single unified, the company is using Salesforce, which created its own problems later when we discovered 57 instances at a company of Salesforce that were in little pockets everywhere, trying to like harmonize it. But the problem they were having was, how do we take something that's been really successful with small and medium enterprises, which is they had over 100,000 customers at that point, and sell into the Fortune 500, where the price tags are much higher. You can close 7, 8, even 9-figure deals instead of 5- and 6-figure deals. But you had to sell a very different way, because you're dealing with tens of thousands of seat licenses and not a 50 or 100 or 200. And that required rethinking the value proposition fundamentally. And what that meant was you had to be able to talk to the C-suite, which is very different than when you're selling to a small business. A sales guy or a sales gal goes in and does a sale. Here, you have to be able to engage the C-suite and talk to them about this technology. Ignite was a consultative selling approach that said, what we're not trying to do is go in and tell them the answer, because there's no way we're going to know their business better than they do. And this is what everybody tries to do, is go and sell them like, hey, I know what your problem is, and here's your widget. And instead, what we want to do is actually ignite the innovation inside of the organization itself. Because part of our talk track with those executives, and this is when we would do these one day, they were called EBCs, Executive Briefing Center meetings, at the top of One Market back at the original headquarters of Salesforce. Beautiful conference room, executives would come in, and it was called Show Up and Throw Up because every different product team, whether it was Sales Cloud or Service Cloud or whatever, would go in and do their 45-minute spiel on their thing and why you need to buy this, right? And then we would come in and we do a totally different, 1 hour session, which is more of an engaging dialogue with them to say, okay, let's talk about your business. Your business was built in the previous century, by the way, and most of your processes were built a long time ago. You might have digitized them when you put in an SAP or whatever else, but they're still basically the same things you've done forever. Now, think about this. And again, this is 2012. The smartphone had just come out 4 to 5 years earlier, but there was mass adoption at that point. And so we said, look, all of your employees already know how to use this technology, but your business is not designed for the technology that they're used to using now. So imagine it's 8 a.m. in your parking lot, the employee comes in, they park the car, and they sit there and they forget everything they know. They go into your business and they do things the way you've been doing them for the last 30 years. And then when they come out at the end of the day, they rejoin the 21st century, pick up their smartphone, and they're back in the real world. They didn't have to get trained on how to use these things. They know how to use them. What you're not doing is rethinking your business to take advantage of what your employees not only know how to do, but are expecting how to do. And what's really important is the world is changing and your customers are expecting a whole different way of engaging with you as a business that they didn't expect 5 years ago. And this was a whole area called liquid expectations, where it was, in the old days, I expected a certain level of service from my bank and I compared them to other banks. And I expected a certain level of service from my airline and I compared them to other airlines. I did not compare my airline to my bank. I did not compare my car rental service to a takeout restaurant. But you know what we all do now? We all look at apps and go, whoa, but why can't this one do this? The other one can do that. That was already happening a decade ago. So what we're saying is, look, you have to rethink it. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to be like coaches and Sherpas. We're going to guide you through this process, but we need your own employees who understand how your business works to actually come up with the idea. What we're going to do is inspire the heck out of them by sharing with them examples from the wild across lots of different industries of how people are already transforming what they're doing, because people, once inspired, will come up with their own way of, oh, I can take that and apply it to this part of my business. We don't know their business. We don't know their process. They do. What they don't know are all these other examples. So when we show somebody how a QR code could be used, again, 10 years ago, pre-pandemic, the QR code could be used to reduce information friction in a process in a hospital ICU, so a nurse could know how to work a piece of equipment by just scanning it. That was game changing, right? Because that's not the way they did things. But once you unlocked it and you showed them, well, here's how somebody is scanning a code right now, they go, you know what? We could save time in our ICUs with our nurses because this is one of their pain points. And so Ignite was called Ignite because what we were doing was lighting the fire in them. And that's why it was so successful. But this could work anywhere. All you need, and in the classes that I teach, I talk about this, all you need is two things. One is a really clear understanding of the problem or problems you're trying to solve, and a knowledge of the art of the possible. And when you stick those two things together, you come up with amazing solutions. We call that, in hindsight, innovation when it's really successful. The reason a lot of innovations don't work is because people focus on the wrong problem and they don't go deep enough. There's a great quote that I love using, which is, if you had an hour to solve a problem, spend 55 minutes defining it and 5 minutes solving it. And in the consulting world, in the business world, in most places, in regular life every day, most people try to figure out what the problem is as fast as possible. Like 8 minutes in, I know what our problem is, or 10 minutes in. And in reality, the best innovations I've ever seen come at the other end. People who actually spend a ridiculous amount of time really understanding the problem, because what they find is those are usually symptoms of the actual root problem. And once they get to that root problem, it changes the solution completely.
Right.
Because that solution is actually really obvious once you figure out what the problem is.
Yeah. It's funny because when I think about storytelling, people often say to me, yeah, like, I had a call earlier today, like, we just need a great story for our business. Can you just help us write it? And I said, well, who's the audience? And like, oh, I don't know. We hadn't really thought about like who exactly we're delivering it to. And I was like, Yeah. And what do they want to get out of your interaction with them? And they're like, I don't really know. And I'm like, well, they certainly want to make money. We're an investment house. I'm like, that's great. And I said, have you ever decided to add the phrase at the end of that sentence, we want to make money so that, because
Yep.
any financial services house that you go to is going to promise that they can make you money. But the question is, what do you want to do with it once you've made it?
Right.
And make more may very well be the answer, but that is the differentiator that allows you to tell a story that actually resonates with the audience, not just tell the story of we're here to help make you money, right? That wasn't the problem to begin with. The problem was I really want to become a philanthropist. The problem was I really want to figure out how to diversify my portfolio so that I'm terrified of risk because I've been burned before.
Yep.
Right. So
Exactly.
all of those conversations. And so the best storytelling, like you said, starts off with really great listening.
It has to. And most people, there was a quote, I want to say it was from Pulp Fiction, where Therma's character says, are you listening to what I'm saying? Or are you just thinking about what you're going to say? Focus on, what do I need to say next? What do I need to sell next? What do I need to do? Rather than just sitting there. And people are uncomfortable with silence. That's the other thing. I love doing this when I interview candidates. I'll ask a question, they'll answer, and I'll just sit there. And then I'll answer more, and I'll sit there, and then they'll keep answering because people don't like silence. But that's where you can do your best thinking, is that spaces in between. So, anyway.
So let's go. So that layer number one is Salesforce. And, I'm fascinated by, how that ignite culture, and while you were talking, I kept thinking of this image of a fire. And I was like, you can also just show somebody a fire and they go, ooh, warm. Or you're like, wow, let's stick a piece of meat in it. Or like, let's melt iron with it. Right. Like there's so many things. Let's write a song about it. Right. There are a million things that you could do with that fire.
Exactly. And that's part of the issue. That's where you're getting into creativity. And I remember a video I saw years ago where John Cleese used to teach a class on creativity. Maybe he still does, but it was, and there's videos you could get. And it was, creativity to me was always really when you see other people who've done something or found a new use for it, your brain then extends in a new direction it may never have done before. And so I remember early on when I was at Accenture, 15 years ago, I'd do a class internally on creativity and innovation. And I'd just pick a random object and I'd say to the group of people, it'd be 10 or 15 people, and I'd say, okay, take this. What can you use it for? And, people go, oh, well, it's a tin. Okay. And then somebody else would go, and they would all think in that same dimension, that one dimension was come up until somebody said, I could use this as a hockey puck. Okay. And then all of a sudden it would be, what other sports uses could I have for it? Right. But they could extend in a direction they'd seen, but a lot of people struggle with things they'd never seen before, trying to then come up with that new thing. But once they saw it, they were just as creative in that dimension. And so a lot of it, and this is what fed part of Ignite, was inspiration is what makes people creative. They see it and then they connect it to their own problem. And that's where it comes in. So innovation, and I hate the word, even though it's been in my title multiple times, because it's so overused and poorly defined. Some people use it as a verb, some use it as a noun, some use it as an adjective. Some people, they think innovation is, I need to, for instance, if you're a chief innovation officer, half the people I've met, and I've been to lots of different CIO roundtables, we used to run them in the past as well. Half of the people think their job is to be Steve Jobs, and the other half think their job is simply to run the process. and it depends, right? There's no simple answer to it, but it's like one of the worst defined jobs in the world. And oftentimes you're handed the job and then you're not handed any of the resources to go with it because a company said, oh, we need to have innovation, but nobody defined what it meant by what is innovation for our company. And so it's under resourced, it's not plugged into the organization well, it's got all these other problems that come as a result of not knowing what problem you're trying to solve. And so I think I talked about this on the Samudra call, but when we built the innovation program at Accenture, my first time there back in 2010, we built a global program for one of the operating groups within Accenture called products, which is basically anything that touches consumers, right? So it included pharmaceuticals, it included CPG, retail, automotive, industrial, that sort of thing, travel, transport. And when they asked me, because I was doing client consultant. They said, hey, can you focus inward and help us build an innovation program for Accenture? And my first question to them was, what do you want it for, right? Like, what are you trying to do? Because they said, well, we need to be more innovative. And as we dug into the problem, what we got to was they had a growth forecast, right? They said, we're at this much right now. Next year, we're expecting to be at this level of revenue. And in 3 years, we're expecting to be at this level of revenue. To get there, we have geographic expansion, we have product line expansion, we have a whole range of things that they had already broken down. Everybody had their forecast by account, by service offering, et cetera. And there was a gap. And they said, we need new things to fill that gap. I said, okay, now you've defined the problem and you have a number attached to it. Now we have to work backward and say, well, how much should we be working on? And at what levels of funding in order to get to that goal at that point at the end? Which is what most people never do when they slap on, hey, we need an innovation program. If somebody said, we need an innovation, let's go set up, oh, this is the other part. Let's go set up innovation theater out in Silicon Valley and set up some sort of hub that is totally disconnected from the rest of the company. And it's kind of a technology playground. People come in, they see whiz-bang stuff that after 2 or 3 years is kind of long in the tooth. I know a lot of people who've run those centers who after about 3 years are emailing me and saying, hey, do you know a place where I can get a job? Because even they know that this was more of like a hands-on technology museum and not actually an innovation center.
Right.
And that's because, again, they're not connected to actual problems that need to be solved.
So that's the middle of the sandwich, this consulting layer, right? Of some of your background and the work that you've done. And I'm curious, having dealt with so many clients in this space then, right? Whether it's products or otherwise, can you share with us some of the stories, that because compelling people, especially clients, to really take on innovation is a challenge. Some of the innovations that you've worked on that either you're particularly proud of or you think really, or you can talk about a spectacular failure if you prefer, but so many of my guests do.
I'm going to talk about both because
Great,
I think
great.
both are really,
Please.
really indicative.
Please, Shubber, please.
So I'll start with the failure first.
Okay.
This is my favorite project that never got done. It was work we were doing for a telco, and they had a yellow pages, white pages are. And this was 2013. Now, if by 2013, I'm sure everybody who's watching or listening to this podcast is thinking, who used the phone book, right? And that's a great question. But they were still printing them and they were dropping them dutifully. And the oatmeal had this great comic that said, it showed like 1920 to 1990. Oh, look, the phone book's here. And then it shows 2007 to today. And the person takes the phone book and just drops it in the recycle bin and then pulls out their smartphone, right?
Right.
This was the actual existential crisis they were having, which is, what do we do if we are the phone book company, right? Because it's great to say, oh, you shouldn't be doing that. But if your business is a $4 billion business printing yellow pages and white pages and distributing them, you got a problem, right? And so we took that on, and having run small businesses before, I actually was able to bring a little bit of my personal pain point into this as well as one of the customers of Yellow Pages. Yellow Pages existed for a reason since the start of the phone industry. And that problem that they existed for has never gone away, even after the invention of the smartphone. It just
that's
changed.
to prop up little kids in the barber chair. Is that right? Like for their first
No, it's
haircut?
actually that small. Well, that too, and also to reach the gas pedals if you're. But it's the problem is actually small businesses have always struggled to connect with consumers in their own community, especially as the model of the city and suburbia evolved, so that people spent more time in their cars and less walking past the stores on Main Street. When you walk past places, you see them and you remember them. When you're driving past them, you don't even know this. So what ends up happening is you end up with larger big box stores and other things that create these malls and these anchors and the rest that actually helps to hollow out Main Street. Walmart's the most extreme example of what it did to much of small town America. But the issue is, if you are that small business and you were struggling, in the old days, you may remember this. If you open the phone book and you looked at any letter in the alphabet, there was always like an A, plumbing.
That's right.
They want to be very first one. So when somebody go to that category, whatever it was, you were more likely to get picked. Or they take out a really big ad that would be the full page. And this is how they made their business, how they made their money, and how small businesses connected with the customer. Well, fast forward to 2012, small businesses actually had a worse problem than they had back in the 70s and 80s and 50s and 60s, even the 90s, because now you had these much bigger national brands that had loyalty programs, had all these other things going for them, had technology budgets so they could do things like apps and all the rest. How's a small business ever going to compete with that? And oh, by the way, if you're a plumber, why do you need a loyalty program? Or if you're a florist, why do you need a loyalty program? Or if you're, the baker on the street, right? It doesn't make sense. So what's the problem? The problem is small businesses are struggling even more to connect with the people in their community and vice versa, because they want a thriving small business area in their community. Well, when we presented back to, after we did the workshops and all the rest of that, we presented back to the CEO and his team. And we said, look, the phone book is dead. The problem exists. Here's the problem. And here's how you're going to solve it. And when we showed them a solution, which was a platform that could connect all the small businesses, small community with the community. And for instance, it had a single fungible reward program so that you could get help from the plumber, and the points you would earn there, you could use at the florist or at the baker or at the local car wash, and vice versa, because it was one pool that was your town community, thing. And it was, they loved it. When we showed it to them, they were so excited to do it. And the CEO was like, we are going to do this. Except they were owned by a telco. And that telco was never going to use Salesforce. And so what ended up happening? The CIO of the telco said, that's a great idea. You're not going to do it. And 2 years later, that business was sold for 1/8 the value of the value they had when we did the project for them. Totally missed opportunity. So
Right.
to me, that's the one that got away, because it was so obvious, and the problem still exists today, and even more so now. And there are lots of intermediaries who jump in the way, whether it's instant delivery with Uber Eats or Grubhub or Instacart or whatever else. There are lots of things that are jumping in the way of small businesses, but the small businesses themselves, which are the lifeblood of many economies, are still struggling. And so somebody's got to crack that. So anybody who's listening, if you want to go build this, there's a market. So the one I'm excited about is the one I'm doing. So Garden for Wildlife, gardenforwildlife.com, for-profit subsidiary of a not-for-profit, the National Wildlife Federation, which is coming up on 100 years old. It's a major not-for-profit here in the US. I've been a supporter for decades, and 3 years ago, I did some consulting work with them to focus on a problem, which is a massive problem that they've been trying to address for almost 50 years through an educational program, but that wasn't enough. And the problem is very simple. How do consumers get educated on it and then get access to and buy native plants to where they live? And the trick is native to where they live, right? NW had all this great research and all this great science, and they even had programs like Certified Wildlife Habitats, where you could actually get this really cool sign for your yard if you met all the criteria. And even real estate agents are putting their listings now, which is kind of cool. But the hardest part was, how do I find the right plants for my yard? Because when you go to a garden center like Lowe's or Home Depot or whatever, the plants that are there are primarily invasive species that are also grown commercially, and they use lots of bad chemicals and things. The result being that we are killing off the pollinators, and through that, killing off the birds in this country, which is why 3 billion pairs of birds have disappeared, nesting songbirds, and why so many insects have disappeared across this country. And that's really bad for us as a species. So with all that as context, went to NWF, ran some workshops. We ended up hitting on, how do we solve that pain point? And the answer was to create a business, which was an e-commerce business right in time for the pandemic, to sell curated native plants, curated down to the zip code level. So if you were in where I live in, Montgomery County, Maryland, and I type in my zip code, I would only see plants that were native to where I live. And if I was in, Chesapeake, Virginia, I would see a different set of plants. Some overlap because some plants are native to both areas. But if I was in upstate New York, I would see different plants that are native to that area, et cetera, et cetera. They contracted with commercial greenhouses that were able to grow these using integrated pest management and all the right things, so they didn't use bad chemicals, no neonics or any of that kind of stuff. And then set up a fulfillment chain and launched the business. And I was the first customer. Well, fast forward, and a year later, we wrote a business plan for them to say, look, you really need to spin this out as a for-profit business, because you're a not-for-profit, you don't know how to really run, and you're not designed to run a for-profit company. But this is a multi-billion-dollar market that nobody has even 1% market share in. And with your huge brand reputation, your 10 million plus members, and all those other great bits of goodness, this is an easy one for you to go and grab some real market share and create value for your not-for-profit and for the environment. They agreed. The board agreed spinning it out, which then they asked me to come in and be the CEO of, which I did. And so as of last October, I've been the CEO of Garden for Wildlife based here at NWF headquarters, but we have people all over the country. We sell in 42 states. We are contracted with lots of little small family growers as well now, and we're expanding our grower network. But what we're doing is helping people help the environment in their backyard. And this goes to another part of the problem to solve, which is, when you think about it, so I was doing some work with students at American University this past semester. They used us as their capstone senior business class project.
Cool.
And there were like 15 teams working on Guard for Wildlife, which was awesome. And great students. They brought a whole different perspective because Gen Zers and that age group has a very different perspective on a lot of things, including gardening, because most of our customers are kind of more affluent, older gardeners. And what we want to do is help the next generation as well. And one of the things that came out of that work was, you think about climate change, you think about the plastic in the Pacific, you think about water and drought in the West, you think about all these kinds of mega problems. There's nothing you're going to do to impact that in any meaningful way. Yes, you should, use a metal straw or a paper straw. Yes, you can use recyclable bags when you shop at the grocery store. Yes, you can, get an electric vehicle or a more fuel efficient gas vehicle, whatever. You can do all these things, but it's not going to actually fix the problem. What's really awesome, and I saw it in my own yard, which is why I'm truly a huge believer in this, is you can take, even if you just got a patio, you can take a patio in a container, or if you've got a lawn, just take a small section. You don't have to replace the whole lawn, but take, a 4 by 6 foot section, line it with some really nice paver stones if you want, and put in a couple of native plants. And within the first year, you will see the difference. We had monarch caterpillars in our yard. The very first year we planted the milkweed and the asters. We have, when I first moved in my house, we had one eastern bluebird. Never seen one before. Beautiful bird. We now have 8 nesting pairs in our yard. We have a whole range of wildlife. It feels kind of like Wild Kingdom in our yard now because we have so many cool birds, turtles. I put a pond in that I just dug while I was on pandemic phone calls. I dug a pond, put in a liner, and now we have a great blue heron that hangs out there and eats the toads that showed up. So it's just like, you can do all these things at any scale you want, but it empowers the individual who feels like maybe the world is just overwhelming with those problems and saying, you can actually be part of making a solution, and you will see it the first year and every year thereafter where you are. And when you talk to people, and this, I want to bring this back to the innovators, there's a great TED Talk done by Simon Sinek, who's now written many books, but the TED Talk that got him started, we used to show this at all of our Ignite sessions with clients, was the one where he talks about the golden circle and the why versus the how and the what of an organization. Yeah. Start with Why is the book that came from that.
Right.
But if you watch that, just Google, the TEDx talk, the first 6 minutes is it. And I 100% believe this is true, which is when people connect with you emotionally and connect with your mission, when you talk about storytelling and talk about the rest, it has to connect at the why level. And if it does that, the rest of it doesn't matter. Get people, and when you look at the great leaders who are out there, you look at the messaging that went down from whether it's, at SpaceX, it's Occupy Mars. When you say we need to be on Mars, it changes everything you do in the organization because you have to make it reusable. You have to make it work. You have to be willing to take risks and experiment and blow stuff up a lot to get the things that work very quickly, right? When you say save them all, if you're Best Friends Animal Society, you say we're going to make the whole country no kill by 2025. That is a really clear mission for every person who works in that not-for-profit about how we are going to help shelters become no kill, how we're going to help people not have to surrender their pets in the first place, because that's actually an upstream problem to the shelter, which is why are animals being surrendered? Because, for instance, people who are, in lower economic classes, oftentimes they're challenged with just even having food for the pets. Well, it turns out you can set up pet food banks, which is what they did. And then the people never have to surrender their loved family member, the pet,
right,
which is better for the family, better for their emotional health, better for the animal, obviously, and eliminates the intake at the shelter, which leads to a kill later on. But it all starts with a really simple, oftentimes very short, explainable message that everybody gets, whether it's save them all, occupy Mars, Maru C, which is what Komatsu did 50 years ago when they said we want to take on Caterpillar. Everybody in the company knew Maru C, which just means encircle Caterpillar. It was from the old game of Go. It was like, these kinds of messages really work, or think different if you're Apple, right? So those kinds of things work really well, but they're hard because it requires taking the time to understand why do we actually exist and what are we here for? And it's not about making money. Money's a byproduct.
For sure. And so, part of that, I love the way you talk about this because it's about re-examining the cultural structures that got us where we are. And
Yep.
if we think about doing that, even in the companies where we work, and I know this for you, Shubber, even this work with Garden for Wildlife extends into the corporate entity. Like, so
Yep.
you can bring this concept of like bringing nature to a different position of also like just reinventing and re-innovating, is that a word? Innovating the corporate wellness structure. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So it's interesting because all these dots connect, and I'm a big believer that it's if you step far enough back, you can see the pattern, right? The corporate world has, in the last few years, really taken on this whole thing around ESG and sustainability. What they struggle with is, okay, but what are we going to do with that, right? We know we have to be more, whatever our employees want it. Oftentimes, if we're a supplier to somebody else, now they're requiring it in the supply chain and all those different things.
Well,
But
in the
what are
SEC, we
going
have to report it. We have to report
Yeah,
it.
exactly. We have to report it. So, and then of course you get into all the greenwashing stuff that's going on, because there's lots of like people will buy credits, and then it's like a bunch of sticks stuck in the ground somewhere, and they call that a tree farm, but it's like that's not really offsetting carbon for a long time.
Right. Or the same plot is sold for 1,000 times as the same piece of credit space.
Yeah, which I think they took a page from all those people who naked short stocks and like basically create all that. But anyway, the issue here is, how do you make it something where the employees can get involved? So let's take the wellness piece first. The corporate wellness market is a multi-tens of billions of dollars marketplace that's popped up. A lot of the stuff that's out there is just thrown at employees because companies don't know what to do with it. So like, okay, we're going to give you this, subscription to this, meditation app. We're going to give you this. We're going to give you that. But adoption rates aren't always great. But they're paying for it because they can check a box, right? And HR is like, what can I do? Check box on wellness. How can I help the employees? What they really want is, how do I actually make my employees more engaged, happier, healthier? Because that's better for the company, right? And to do that, one of the ways we found is there's a lot of science that's come out in the last 2 years about the positive health impacts of both gardening, obviously, but then also even just hearing birdsong. So having songbirds in your yard actually will improve your happiness level, which is measurable. And there were these great scientific studies that came out just in the last couple of years on that, on how much it's actually improving people's health. So what a company can do from a wellness point of view is simply, hey, we're going to give you some plants, put them in your garden, put them in a container. They're native to where you are, so we're helping the environment, which now they can report, not just use it for wellness, but they can report it in their ESG metrics, right? How much square footage of habitat did I create? How much carbon did I sequester? Because perennials have these amazing root structures that go down 5 or 6 feet instead of like turf, which is 4 or 6 inches. And so there's all this stuff they can report by actually doing something good for their employees. So they're getting kind of a double win, so to speak, of that.
Shubber, I think my internet went out for a minute there.
Did you just lose all that?
I did. I got from ESG goals when you talked about reporting back to it. I think we cut out at the end there. Sorry about that.
That was the best part. Okay. All right. I'll say it again. So essentially you can meet 2 targets at the same time. So the company's got ESG goals they're trying to report and do the rest. But at the same time, wellness is this multi-tens of billion dollar marketplace. But there's a lot of stuff in there that is really not used very well, or the HR department buys it thinking, well, let's give everybody a meditation app, or let's go and, give them a credit so they can go get, I don't know, Instacart or whatever else. And different organizations do different things. They spend money on stuff. But there's a way they can kind of hit both metrics at the same time, because there's all this great science now on the actual measurable impact from a positive side of both gardening on your health, but also birdsong on your happiness. So there's some great research that came out this last year. I actually posted it on LinkedIn, where some scientists actually were able to show that birdsong had a measurable impact on people's happiness. Okay, so here's how you connect the two of them, which is companies can give their employees plants, right, that are native to their area. So it's actually like, it's really easy. They just check the box and they shipped it. We did this with Accenture when we launched this thing, and 500 employees got free plants, right? So they could put it in there, they plant it. What's really nice is we can then give the company the ESG metrics to go with it, because we have square footage of habitat created, number of species helped, because we know exactly which pollinators and which bird species are helped by which plants they get. And because the perennials and these bushes and trees have amazing root structures. If you look at the root structure of a perennial, it oftentimes goes down 5 or 6 feet. It kind of looks like the beard of a ZZ Top, guitarist, versus sod, which goes down 4 to 6 inches. So all that carbon in this really dense kind of matrix that goes down is additional stuff they can count. They're not buying it from some third party. They're actually putting it in the ground, and it's all trackable. But then they can report that as well. So they get the win of, we get to do some ESG reporting, but really what they get is, we're making our employees happier and healthier, which pays back, in huge amounts for the business itself.
Well, I have to say, it was about 5:45 this morning when I heard the first birds on my balcony, and I was like, curse you. I needed my extra 15 minutes, Shubber, and they got me.
Well,
early.
You know what? It's a trade-off. I sit on my balcony every morning. I'm an early riser, so maybe that's why I love this. But I sit on my porch before the sun comes up, when the sky is just starting to light up, and you can hear the crescendo begin, right? So it starts with, I hear the end of the owls that are in the woods, and then different birds start coming, and I have now probably 20 different species I can hear, and they're all distinct. When it first started, it was a cacophony. Now I sit out there with my coffee, and it is the most peaceful, calming, focusing thing for me to sit there and just listen to birds for half an hour before I start my day. And I'm doing thinking and I'm writing stuff down, but it's just so relaxing. And it's hard to describe until you've had it. I actually posted that on LinkedIn. I posted a 30-second clip, and a bunch of people loved it because it was here's a little slice of nature for you. And you can have that in your own yard. So people who love the outdoors, bring it back to your yard.
Yeah.
It's that easy, and you're helping the environment.
Fantastic. All right. Well, I'm going to get some container pots for my little balcony, all 25 square feet of it, so that
I will get you some plants. I can do that for you for having me on as a guest. I will get you some plants.
Well, let's make sure we extend this. So, okay. So I ask all my guests who come on the Innovation Storytellers Show 3 not so hot seat questions. Let's call it the lukewarm seat. So let me ask you this. Okay. Greatest innovation of all time. What is, in your estimation, Shubber, what is it?
The greatest innovation of all time? Storytelling.
Wow. How innovative is that, do you think? Or do you think storytelling has evolved and that's why?
I don't think it's evolved. I think it's being relearned. Storytelling, up until really the creation of the printing press, the Middle Ages, was the way we learned as a species, the way we communicated things, ideas, all of that only happened by storytelling. Sure, occasionally somebody would write something down, and then these things would get, but that was secondary. It was storytelling. But then once we got to the industrialized version of it, which was mass-produced, printing things, getting things out there, all the rest of that, we lost the ability to communicate and lost the ability to tell stories. And what's now coming back and is in vogue again is actually something people were really good at a long time ago, because we had to be. That's how you communicate it. And stories, we are a storytelling species. It's why it's such an engaging way. Like, one of my favorite things is movies. I love movies. I can see movies. My favorite movies I can see many times over. And then I have a whole category which I ask people over, like, what are your guilty pleasure movies? Back in the days when everybody had cable, it was, you'd be flipping channels, and it didn't matter where you were in the movie, you would stop what you were doing and you watch the rest of that movie, even though you've seen it maybe 100 times before. And so for me, things like Shawshank Redemption, Apollo 13, right? There's just these certain movies that would suck you in because they were great stories.
What's yours, Shubber?
So Shawshank, anywhere in that movie, I can jump right in. Apollo 13 is another one, even though I know exactly what happened, and I worked in the space industry, so I really know what happened. But I call it guilty pleasure because it's also movies like Independence Day, right? I love that movie, and when he gives his speech toward the end, he goes, "This is not just an American holiday," right? I love that movie. I can watch that over and over again, right? But that's because they're great stories, and the movie theater industry is, like, AMC is really good. Before their movies, they show these things with Nicole Kidman now that talks about the power of stories and being with a group of people and seeing a story. It's why live performances, why Broadway is so important. What is a great Broadway play? It's a great story.
Sure.
The music's great and all the rest of it, but it better be a damn good story.
All right. One more question. 2 more questions.
Yes, go ahead.
Innovation does not happen by just one person, right? This is not that we're breaking the Steve Jobs myth here of independent genius. If you had the opportunity to join any innovation team in the history of humanity, which team would you join?
Oh, wow. Assuming I actually had the the technical chops to be part of it, right? Because a lot of it was engineering related. Well, I have to think about that, but the first one that comes to mind for me would be the Falcon 9 team at SpaceX.
So for those of us who don't know,
they made a reusable rocket. Now, I had actually talked about this 25 years ago at one of the first FAA space conferences, because I started my career post business school in aerospace and defense. And back then I was giving talks on this at conferences about how we have to create a reusable rocket. The shuttle was not a reusable rocket. It was a bad example of what happened when you let Congress design a space system. And they lied about like the economics of it. But in order for us to actually truly open up space and go there, which of course as a kid who grew up on Star Trek, I dreamed about and the rest, you had to have a reusable rocket. The only way to change the economics of the space industry is to have a reusable rocket. Elon Musk just recruited some of the best people from other engineering firms, including the Boeings, the Lockheeds, and the rest of the world. Anybody could have done what they did, but they did it and they made it. And the first time that rocket landed successfully, they are now about to do their 200th successful, and maybe actually it happened yesterday, 200th successful launch with that rocket.
Amazing.
Like, that's double the record of any other rocket company in history, right? The Delta II by Boeing, which was retired a few years back, did 100 launches. Those are all independent rockets because every one of them blew up after they sent it into space. But SpaceX brings them back and lands them and sends them up again. And why that's important is because that allows them to now take on the telco industry in $1 trillion business called internet services. Starlink was only possible because he has really cheap rockets because he gets to refly them. And so in 5 years from the start to the finish, from the first reusable landing of a Falcon rocket to 5 years later, they went from basically no market share to over 50% of the entire global launch industry.
Wow.
That's amazing. Innovation.
That's innovation for sure. Okay, last question. What is something that annoys the hell out of you or something you wish would exist on the planet that has not been innovated yet, that has not existed yet?
All right, I'll go back to one. This is actually an idea that I worked on when I was at Accenture. I'm going to just throw it out there for everybody. But people have done versions of this, and that actually is a really good innovation point. One of the biggest killers of innovation, people say, oh, we tried something like that. Yes, but you didn't try that, right? And oftentimes the difference between success and failure is 2 degrees off.
That's right.
Because
3 feet from
they didn't
gold.
quite get it right.
Yep.
Right. And so this is the one. And so people who, when they hear me say this, go, oh, well, so-and-so is doing something like that. It's not the same thing. But and it's not because I'm a freaking genius. I actually worked on this with a bunch of people. But the idea is really simple. The movie industry is dying. It's dying because if you think about many of the great innovations that came out since the invention of the smartphone in particular are really about utilizing underutilized assets. What is Uber? It's 2 underutilized assets being connected to somebody who needs them, a car and a driver, right? Anybody can connect to a car and a driver. Uber is just a platform that makes the connection. Yep. Airbnb takes an empty room or a house or a castle or a tree house or a sofa, connects it to somebody who needs a place to stay. That's it. That's all they do. Underutilized assets are everywhere, right? The movie industry exists with a 92% unused capacity in its design, right? You go into a movie theater on Tuesday afternoon, you might be the only person there. Friday nights, Saturday nights, maybe Saturday matinees, pretty good, but the rest of the time, basically empty. So what's one of the pain points customers have? And the studios know this because they've actually proven it. There are lots of movies I want to see on the big screen that aren't available on the big screen. They were at one point in the past. Right? Star Wars came out on the big screen. Can you see it on the big screen today if you wanted to? No, right? When Endgame came out, why wasn't every theater out there showing Infinity War again right before that? How many people would have bought a ticket to see it again on the big screen right before the next one? You got all this unused capacity. You have all this content in the vault, whether it's, studio movies, it's Netflix movies, it's TV shows, Game of Thrones, right? Whatever it was.
Oh my God, Game of Thrones would be awesome on the big screen. I never even thought of that. Yes.
Day of the Doctor, if you're a Doctor Who fan, Day of the Doctor in Britain, when that episode came out a few years back, they showed it on movie theaters as well. A bunch of Whovian fans got together and saw it in theaters with other fans, and they did millions of dollars in revenue from something you could have watched on the BBC. Why? Because people want to get together and see stories. We want a community, but also there's so much content. When my kids, when they were younger, I have twins, and we want to do a birthday party, I would have totally booked out a theater to watch Finding Nemo, their favorite movie, with a bunch of other kids. But you know what? Once it's booked, there's no reason why other parents with kids who want to take their kids to see Finding Nemo couldn't come too. And all of a sudden, movie theaters are finding ways to use their capacity. So the thing to me that's killing me is the studios and the theater companies. So Adam Aron, CEO of AMC Theaters, if you're watching this, you're listening to this, this is what you need to do. This is how you save the movie industry.
Amen. What a great, great, great idea. Shubber Ali from Garden for Wildlife and so many more. Thank you for this delicious club sandwich of a show, taking us all the way through from Salesforce to Accenture to the wilds of nature. Thank you so much. If people want to get in touch with you or learn more about Garden for Wildlife, what should they do?
You can just email me. It's Ali, S-A-L-I-S, at gardenforwildlife.com. And I would love to hear from you. Also connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to talk with you. Susan, thank you for the time. This was awesome.
Thank you so much for joining me.
Of course.